Hi, I'm Geerges. China has now surpassed the United States as the world's largest economy by purchasing power. Now, will China challenge American supremacy in the Pacific? Is it possible that the U.S. and China could go to war?
We have been the dominant air and naval power in the Western Pacific ever since World War II. So as China gets stronger, it's inevitably going to be in a contest for who is the more dominant power in the Western Pacific.
Welcome to the Geerges Show. President Trump campaigned, of course, on making America great again. When China's leader, Xi Jinping, took power in 2012, he essentially said he would make China great again. Given that the U.S. and China are the two largest economies and militaries in the world, that could put us on a course for confrontation. Here to discuss the tensions with China and what we should do about it is Ambassador Stapleton Roy. He's a former U.S. ambassador to China and currently the director of the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Is it possible that the U.S. and China could go to war during the Trump administration?
No.
Why?
Because if you've experienced war, and some people in the Trump administration have, but not all of them, you have to have an issue important enough to justify the incredible damage that a war between two countries like the United States and China could have. Make a distinction between war and conflict. Could we have a little clash here or a little clash there? That's conceivable, but it would be a breakdown of discipline and leadership on the part of militaries on one or both sides. Because the escalation problem is always severe when you're dealing with big countries like the United States and China.
If we did have clashes,
Yes.
as you call it, what would it be about?
It most likely would be the South China Sea. There you could have little clashes because of the fact that we're carrying out these freedom of navigation operations there. And in some cases, the Chinese feel that we're challenging their claims to the islands where we do these operations. They might try to interfere, and then you get elbowing by the navies. And that's why with the Soviets, for example, we had an incidents at sea agreement to try to prevent that type of behavior.
So let's talk about the South China Sea. There are islands that are uninhabited. What is it about these islands that's making everybody so nervous?
Nobody paid any attention to these islands for hundreds of years. They were essentially impediments to navigation. But when people began to think there might be oil, hydrocarbon resources on the seabed, all of a sudden interest in claiming the islands emerged. China, as early as 1935, was assigning names to the islands in the southern South China Sea.
But why do they want them? Why are they important?
Well, it's called the South China Sea, and there's a reason for that. Because Chinese junks historically sailed throughout these waters, but so did the fishing vessels of the countries on the periphery of it. The Chinese like to say that they discovered these islands. That's like saying that Columbus discovered the Western Hemisphere. We know that the Scandinavians were in the Western Hemisphere before Columbus, and of course it was inhabited by people who had been there. So the idea that China discovered the waters where the indigenous people have been fishing for millennia is what I call the Columbus complex.
But now they've put runways on these islands. There's military equipment there. Why are they doing that?
Well, some of the other claimants have also fortified the islands. One of the reasons why I think we have not been as skillful in handling the South China Sea issue as we should have been is because we thought of China as being a centralized government in total control of how it was behaving, and that's not true. Within China, you have a historic problem of those elements that want to have Chinese behavior contained within grounds that are defensible under international law. And of course, the key piece is the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, which we have signed but not ratified. But you also have Chinese who want to put forward expansive claims to the South China Sea, including to the waters of the South China Sea, disassociated from the islands.
And can we let that happen?
Are we the global policeman? It's not up to us to let it happen or not happen. We have an interest, but our interest is in freedom of navigation, not in who owns the islands. And we have no claims to the islands ourselves.
But let me ask you, is China preparing for war with the U.S.?
Yes, of course. And we're preparing for war with China. We're
Okay,
preparing for
that's
war
normal.
with Russia.
Everybody's okay with that.
This is what militaries do.
That's what they do.
They-
But we're still obviously the largest military in the world, but can China close that gap with us? Do you think it's conceivable that their military matches ours?
yes.
When's that going to happen?
Here's your problem. In the 19th century, China's wars were all fought inside China. In the 20th century, they were all fought on China's borders. India in 1962, Korean War, the clashes with Vietnam, the clashes with Russia on the Damansky, Junbaodao island issues. China now is a big, wealthy country, large population. It doesn't want to be so weak that wars are fought inside China or on its borders. So China is trying to develop defense capabilities that will give it better protection than it was able to provide in the past. The problem is that we have been the dominant air and naval power in the Western Pacific ever since World War II. So as China gets stronger, it's inevitably going to be in a contest with us for who is the more dominant power in the Western Pacific.
But is that okay with us? Can we just let China be dominant in the Pacific and then we just kind of concede that to them?
You have to think about what's right and what's wrong. Does China have a right to legitimate self-defense? Yes. But if we use our military strength to take islands away from China, this is where Taiwan comes in, then we have a potential war-fighting issue. But if we don't do that, then you can have a strong Chinese military and the United States doesn't have a war-fighting issue with Japan. But we have alliances in the Western Pacific that are of fundamental interest for us. If China gets so strong that Japan and South Korea lose confidence that the Americans can come to their assistance, China is attacking one of our fundamental interests. We are not attacking China's fundamental interests because we have an understanding in the One China policy that we are not challenging their territorial issue. So is there middle ground? That's what good diplomacy would be exploring. Can we have two strong militaries in the Western Pacific that don't see war-fighting issues at stake between them?
What are our allies in the Pacific thinking right now? Do they feel confident that the United States is there for them, that we're not going to concede their interests to China?
They're very worried about the United States.
Why?
At the present time. Because they see us as turning inward. They worry the repudiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership by the new Trump administration severely undermined our position in East Asia. Because, as you know, the Obama administration had the so-called pivot to Asia, or which was later called the rebalancing strategy. But it was all military, because we didn't fund the other aspects of it. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was a symbol of the fact that we intended to be a major trading partner in East Asia.
Right. So this is a trade agreement with everybody in East Asia, essentially, except China.
Believe it or not, what people are worried about in East Asia is not Chinese military aggression. It's being dominated economically by China. And that applies to Taiwan as well. I was in Taiwan having dinner with some admirals and generals, and they were talking about being swallowed up by China. Well, being an American, I thought they were talking about military. No, they were talking about being swallowed up economically and socially, losing their identity, because they don't think of themselves exactly the same way that mainland Chinese do.
So the Trump administration pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership,
has taken away that economic component, and people are all very worried about it.
You think that was a mistake?
I think it was a big mistake.
Well, during the campaign, Donald Trump used to say things like, quote, "We can't continue to allow China to rape our country." And he always railed against unfair trade practices. Is that true? Is China engaged in unfair trade practices with us?
Yes, and there are.
So shouldn't we change that?
Well, we need a context for thinking about that, don't we?
Okay.
Okay, let's look at the World Trade Organization. Do countries bring unfair trading practice cases against the United States? Yes. Do we win all those cases? No. We win some of them, we lose some of them. So in other words, we also engage in practices that other countries think are unfair. China does so in a larger scale, in our judgment, and the statistics support that. But there are mechanisms in the World Trade Organization for dealing with unfair trading practices. Have we used those mechanisms adequately? Perhaps not. So there is a ground for wanting to be more rigorous in trying to bring World Trade Organization cases against China for unfair trading practices. We shouldn't sit and let China rip us off. And in stealing our intellectual property, that's been a big issue on our agenda bilaterally with China. The cyber theft of our secrets has been a big issue in our, and in fact we got progress with China on that issue, where they agreed that it was wrong to use cyber theft to steal economic secrets. All governments will steal political or military secrets. But to steal economic secrets and then use it to benefit your own countries, that is now agreed between China and us is improper behavior. So there are ways to deal with these questions, and you don't have to do it unilaterally by putting up unilateral tariff barriers.
We have a $300 billion trade deficit with China. What impact does that have in our ability to negotiate with them on any of these issues?
None.
Really? What's $300 billion among friends?
Don't forget the $300 billion is reflected in the fact that we have cheap goods in the stores where you buy your clothes. Mm-hmm. Look at the labels on your clothing. It's made in China, it's made in Malaysia, it's made in Jordan, it's made in other countries like that, because we are no longer an efficient manufacturer of clothing in many areas. The reason we didn't have inflation when we were pouring money into our economy after the financial crisis is because we had goods coming in from China that were cheaper than goods that would have been otherwise produced in the United States. So in other words, what about American consumers? Do they matter? Does it matter to the American, if an employed American worker suddenly discovers that the Walmart clothing that they have been used to be buying at $10 for a shirt goes up to $30 for a shirt, is that person happy?
No.
Well, see, that has to do with the import aspect of things.
Yeah.
Now, of course, if you don't export, then you lose the jobs that would be associated with export. But you can't say exports are good and imports are bad. Imports benefit the consumer, export benefits the worker.
So what does China want from us?
China wants a stable relationship because China sets long-term ambitious goals. They have one goal of doubling the size of their economy in this decade by 2020. They have a goal by 2021, which is the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, of eliminating abject poverty in the country. They have a goal by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, of raising the per capita standard of living in China to that of an average European country. Do we think in terms of those types of long-term goals? The answer is no. To achieve those goals, China has to have stable relations with the most developed countries in the world. And that includes the United States and includes the European countries. China wouldn't be at its current level of development if it had not established diplomatic relations with the United States in '79 and had the benefit of the interactions between our economies over the last few decades.
And they also want to be dominant in the Pacific, which would mean we need to concede that.
The best way to understand what China wants to be in the Pacific is what we want to be in the Western Hemisphere. Do we want to dominate all the countries out here? No, that's not the right word. But on key issues, we want them to be deferential to our interests. Yes,
yeah.
China wants the countries around it to be deferential to its interests, but it's not interested in dominating them.
Japan in the 1930s did some awful things in China and to the Koreans. Do you think the Chinese still hold a grudge about that?
Yes.
And are they going to try to get revenge on Japan?
No, but they bear the grudge. Grudges interfere with your ability to manage a personal relationship. They don't automatically result in vengeful behavior, but it does complicate the ability to have a good relationship. So I think that it's not a question of Chinese taking revenge against Japan. It's that Japan, in Chinese eyes, took advantage of China over an extended period, and therefore, in a sense, the Chinese feel that Japan owes them some repayment for that period of exploitation. The Japanese don't see it that way. And so that leads to tensions between the two countries.
Do you think that could lead us into conflict with China? Their issues with Japan?
No. I'm a career diplomat, retired now. Good leaders don't think of conflict as the way to solve problems.
Right. I wish there were more diplomats like you, but apparently we do have people that are can be trigger happy, frankly.
My career was spent on big countries like the Soviet Union and China. And I found that good leaders on both sides were able to keep us out of conflict most of the time. And that should be the goal. We shouldn't talk lightly about conflict. Surely we have learned something from the post-Cold War period, because without the Soviet Union balancing us, we engaged in wars of choice. And we discovered that there are not military solutions to most of the issues that are out there. We couldn't impose a military solution on Iraq. We couldn't impose a military solution on Afghanistan. In Syria, we've been reluctant to get involved because we don't think that we could impose a military solution. I think we are much too prone to think of a military solution as being there for us to use.
Let's talk about North Korea.
Yeah.
China is their only ally, so shouldn't they be able to use their influence to get them to get in line, essentially?
Yes, if you think that we can force Mexico to pay for the wall. How does Mexico behave when we try to put pressure on them? After all, Mexico is a major source of narcotics coming into the United States.
But I don't think that's a good
it is a good thing because,
analogy.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you why it's a good analogy.
Huh.
Because you deal with neighbors differently from the way you deal with other countries. They're a permanent factor in your relationships in that particular area.
But what's China getting from keeping this regime of Kim Jong-un even in power?
China's relations with North Korea are terrible. They have the lowest possible opinion of Kim Jong-un. When I returned to China as ambassador, I went to Northeast China, and met with the governor of a province with a long common border with North Korea. And I said, have they learned anything from your success with your reform and openness policies? He snorted and said, they've learned nothing. They're still trying to practice socialism. Here I was in communist China. And a senior official was criticizing North Korea because it wasn't moving toward market economics. The Chinese are very angry at North Korea because North Korean behavior is creating problems for China's security interests. It's illustrated by the deployment of our THAAD anti-ballistic missile defense system in South Korea because of North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile development program.
Right.
China thinks that's interfering with China's own missile deterrence capability.
But really, China could have stopped them from getting a nuclear weapon in the first place.
No, it couldn't, any more than we could have.
Wasn't it the Chinese that gave them the...
No, let's go back into history a little bit. We had a nuclear monopoly after World War II.
Yes.
That's right. Our biggest enemy, Soviet Union, developed nuclear weapons.
Right.
We looked at the options, and we figured out we couldn't stop them from doing that. Our next biggest enemy, China, developed nuclear weapons in the 1960s. We looked at the options and decided they were more risky than letting them develop nuclear weapons. Since then, we've had, well, the British and French, our allies, developed nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan in the 1990s, when it became nuclear powers, we didn't stop them. Israel may have developed nuclear capabilities. We don't even talk about that. So in other words, our ability to prevent countries from developing nuclear weapons is limited. Countries close to us have done so, and countries who are extremely hostile to us have done so, and we have not considered a viable military option as being the way to deal with it.
Are you saying that China doesn't have influence with North Korea?
No. I'm saying it does not have the ability to prevent North Korea from developing nuclear weapons, except using measures that we didn't use when we had the option of trying to prevent Soviet Union and China from developing nuclear weapons.
What do you think a typical Chinese guy on the street thinks about the United States?
It depends. When we get lined up, as we have in the South China Sea, or as we have to a degree with the Senkaku issue, with supporting countries that Chinese think are trying to take Chinese territory away from them, then Chinese get hostile to us, and they think of us as enemies. Most Chinese would like to send their children to the United States to study, would like themselves to have the opportunity to visit the United States, and generally, Americans and Chinese get along very well together. But when we have these clashes, especially involving territorial issues, then we can get very angry at each other.
You were actually born in China, and
Yeah.
you spent your childhood
Yes.
there. What was it like?
Well, my family had very bad timing. We were in China throughout World War II. I lived there from 1938 to 1945. We returned to China in 48, just in time for the last years of the Chinese Civil War. And I actually was a 15-year-old high school student in China during the first year of communist rule. Then the Korean War broke out. The next time I went to China was during the Great Cultural Revolution, when the conditions in China were terrible.
Not a good time to go.
And then I was back in our liaison office and participated in the negotiations that resulted in diplomatic relations. So I have seen China as a war-impoverished country, tied up in civil war, caught up in ideological fervor, and then all of a sudden, 35 years of rapid economic development, people studying in the United States. The whole thinking about politics in China has changed radically over the last 3.5 decades, because Chinese now have access to other countries that have ways of dealing with domestic problems that Chinese think they can learn from.
So you've been around for a long time. I'm not
Yes.
calling you old, but you've seen a lot.
I've seen a lot.
What do you think about current U.S.-China relations? Are they at their worst? Is this just kind of par for the course?
I think it's par for the course. I call U.S.-China relations normal. We are big countries. We're at different stages of economic development. Let's remember, when we were a developing country, we stole intellectual property. We established our corporate system based on theft of textile mill plans from Britain. So, in other words, when you don't generate intellectual property yourself, you steal it. When you are a major producer of intellectual property, such as we are, we protect it. China, unlike some countries, actually wants to become a big producer of intellectual property. That means that China increasingly understands that it needs to protect intellectual property. So that we are beginning to get closer in our understanding of the problem.
Let me ask you finally, do you worry about Donald Trump's business interests in China affecting U.S. policy there?
No, he doesn't really have significant business interests in China.
So we're good on that.
I don't think that's a factor in terms of managing the relationship with China.
Okay.
And I would hope that the summit meeting will establish a mutual sense on the part of the leaders of each country that they can deal with the other in managing difficult relations. It doesn't always work out that way. There are some summits that fail. There are some summits that produce results that are misleading. Think of the Munich summit before World War II. Think of the first meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev, when Khrushchev underestimated President Kennedy, and that was one of the factors leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So summits are dangerous, but summits also produce breakthroughs in some cases, such as Nixon's visit to China in 1972. And that's what we're facing now with China. We have two leaders who don't know each other. We have two countries that have very significant potential differences that could lead to low-scale conflict, not to war. And this is a test of leadership on both sides.
Do you think they'll get along personally?
I think
Donald Trump and
I think
Xi?
they will. They're not identical personalities. Your problem with leaders is they all have big egos.
Yes.
The second problem is they're used to being dominant in the people around them. And so when they get together, there's no guarantee that they'll be able to find the right chemistry for working with each other. But I haven't personally met Donald Trump. But my understanding is that when he wants to, he can be a very congenial host. And I have been, over the last 10 years or so, at quite a few meetings with Xi Jinping. And he is the sort of Chinese leader that, in my experience, Americans should be able to deal with effectively. So that I do not approach this summit meeting with pessimism, but you have one leader highly experienced and knowledgeable on all of the issues, and you have a new American president with no political experience, no experience in diplomacy, no experience in national security affairs.
Don't remind me. I know.
No, he'll be a quick learner. But the reason it's important is when you have the types of potential differences between ourselves and China and real differences, you want leaders who think they can work with each other in trying to manage those differences.
Ambassador, thank you so much for being on the program.
Okay.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.